This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political consultant Brad Crone, syndicated author and columnist John Hood, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, and former House Speaker Joe Mavretic. Well, welcome to this Easter edition of NC Spin. The legislature has stepped up the pace of activity this past week and of anticipation of taking a week of spring break next week. So we want to discuss several proposed bills and how they might impact you. Let's get started. While a final verdict hasn't been issued, the preliminary ruling by a three-judge panel was that the proposal to merge the Ethics Commission and the State Board of Elections was unconstitutional, and it violated the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. Well, the House passed a new one, employing a practice that's become too common of late, stripping language from a bill that had already passed the Senate, then inserting that new language and rewriting the merger, but allowing the governor the authority to appoint the new board, however, from a list of names submitted by both political parties and would have to have an equal number from each. Joe, you were House Speaker and served in the legislature for a good while. When the House stripped this Senate bill, then passed it and sent it back to the Senate, then the Senate could only concur or not. They couldn't change the legislation. What do you think about this maneuver?
When I was a Speaker, we never used that practice. I think that transparency is the better way. I like the committee system. I think you ought to use the committee system. I think this way kind of denigrates not only committees, but it kind of makes sheep of the members. I wouldn't like it, but politics is evolutionary.
And we've seen it frequently recently. Brad, the new bill requires both parties to nominate a list of potential people. Then the governor appoints an equal number of Democrats, with the chair rotating between one party and the next from year to year. But traditionally, it's been the case that whomever was the governor, I might say, got to appoint the elections board and generally appointed a person from his or her political party. What's your response to this codicil?
Well, it's clearly the legislature's trying to stack the deck when it comes to the elections board. More interesting, the Republicans made sure that the chairman is the Republicans chair the committee during the general election years, Democrats in the odd number years, which is totally it's just disturbing to me.
John, this bill's got veto written all over it. And so Governor Cooper is going to veto it, send it back to the legislature. They're going to override the veto, and then he says he's going to court. Under the circumstances, and his rationale for this was similar to what Pat McCrory said. The State Board of Elections is an executive agency branch, and that as the executive of the state of North Carolina, he can't administer it if he doesn't have control over it. What do you think of his argument?
I think that was a good argument for the previous version. It was obviously a successful argument in front of judges. The difference here is that the governor is appointing the members. The legislature is no longer appointing the members. That's an important distinction.
But he can't appoint control.
Well, you can. There are plenty of boards in North Carolina and elsewhere where a governor chooses from among people of the other party. That's in fact the way the elections board worked before. It was just a 3-2, that whoever was in charge got the 3 and the minority party got the 2. You have other kinds of election boards around the country that are set up party line. I agree with some of the process objections to it, but I think this bill is measurably different from the standpoint of the separation of powers objection.
Chris, this thing is obviously going to end up in the court and is going to be dragged out, and we're going to spend more millions of dollars in court battles. I guess the question that most of the people that are watching this show and listening to this show are asking is, knowing this in advance, why couldn't the legislature and the governor get together and sit down and negotiate this thing out in a way that
Because the
made
General
sense.
Assembly doesn't want to negotiate it out. They first tried this in an unannounced special session. Now they lost in court. Now they're trying a different way. And the process is part of the big story here. We still haven't had lengthy hearings about what happens in other states. We haven't had testimony about what this would mean. This might not be the worst idea in the world, but we'd never know it the way they're handling it. And as I said on last week's show, and Joe knows this better than anybody, at some point abusing the process comes back to haunt you. If you keep doing these things over and over and over in secret, some of the members who don't have a say, like your senator, had no chance to amend this bill, and that's not right.
I want to move on to some more legislation being considered. Now that it appears that the repeal and replacement of Obamacare is not going to happen anytime soon, many have urged the legislature to expand Medicaid so as to ensure as many as 500,000 North Carolinians. Most of the impetus for Medicaid expansion has come from Democrats, but this past week, 4 prominent Republican members introduced Medicaid expansion bill that would expand the program and would require recipients to pay 2% of their income as premiums, with hospitals picking up the additional cost. It would also include a work requirement for these new recipients. Brad, what do you think of this new Republican legislation?
Well, you got to give kudos to Donnie Lambert from Forsyth County and Dr. Murphy from Pitt County on leading the effort. It is a change in dialogue, John, to see the Republicans at least saying it may not be Medicaid expansion, but it's Medicaid reform. There are federal dollars available that can come into the state of North Carolina and set a program. They have predictability, they have accountability in the Medicaid program. It's a step in the right direction.
Joe, they're
Tom.
saying it's actually going to save money in the long haul because it's going to keep people out of hospital emergency departments and people will begin getting better medical care.
I worry about any statistic that says how much money we're going to save in the long run. Everybody seems to forget that the money that's coming back from the Fed is money that we sent to them in the first place.
Chris, what's your opinion of this concept of the recipients having to pay 2% of their income up to an adjusted level, and also having to have a work requirement? That's similar to what Bill Clinton sort of...
Well, similar to what Mike Pence did in Indiana. And I think there's some, first of all, I think it is an advance in the dialogue. I think we're finally now talking about how to expand health care to people who don't have it. I think some of those details are some of those provisions are too onerous if you're talking about single people who are already ill and don't have any health care and don't have resources to pay that 2%. But I think all those things should be hashed out and negotiated in a thorough committee process, and I think we are going in the right direction, talking about how to take advantage of a federal program and ensure people in North Carolina.
Well, are we going in the right direction, John? Many longtime political observers say that there's been some noise made about this bill being introduced, but it doesn't have much chance of passing.
I think that as long as there are unanswered questions in Washington about what Congress is going to do, and I still think they will do something this session, I think there'll be a lot of resistance, even from people who are intrigued with aspects of this proposal. They will still want to wait and see how it interacts with whatever the new policy is in Washington. I think that again, there are aspects of this, the kind of plan that Republicans often like are things like work requirements, but anytime you see people asserting that Medicaid expansion would reduce costs by reducing use of the emergency room, that's about 25 years out of date. That is not what happens when Medicaid expands. It doesn't reduce emergency room visits. That's the kind of thing.
Ohio says it has.
Lots of politicians make claims. When you look at the data, it doesn't really work out that way. It's not an argument against doing it, but the point here is we are far past those kinds of 1990s arguments, and we need to hear more sophisticated arguments for this proposal.
And the other point of that is that I think we've gotten sophisticated about being very careful about the government handing and then all of a sudden taking it back and saying, now it's your business to pay for it.
Well, that's where the state's going to have to look out for reform at the federal level. Is it block grants or is it per capita reimbursements on Medicaid dollars coming back into North Carolina?
And will the formula, the distribution of costs between the feds and the states under the original plan, which was wacky in the federal, I mean, in the 90 percentile, that is unlikely to be sustained.
You're talking about for expansion.
In the long run, that is not going to happen.
But if they go to block grants, it won't make any difference.
It still affects the formula, yes, it does.
Well, have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle? It's easy to do. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NCSpin on YouTube, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. When we come back, we're going to talk about reducing the number of Court of Appeals judges.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
Our state has more than 300,000 with no options for health insurance. 63% are in working families, one illness away from disaster. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
The legislature's passed a bill that would reduce the number of judges on our Court of Appeals from the current number of 15 to 12. As current judges retire at the mandatory age of 72, they won't be replaced. Sponsors say the case loads for the Court of Appeals has declined. Democrats say it's nothing more than another attempt to prevent Roy Cooper from naming Democratic judges. Chris, what do you think of the idea?
Well, it is another absurd attack on our court system. It's no coincidence that the three judges who were going to retire first are Republicans and would then be replaced by Democrats that Governor Cooper has the authority to appoint. The other thing that was startling about this debate is that Representative Stevens and others were using caseload figures that were simply wrong. I don't know if they misread the spreadsheet. They were given the correct figures. There's really not a dramatic caseload in the drop in the caseload in the Court of Appeals. And what this also will do will send children's adoption cases and other parental rights cases up to the Supreme Court instead of the Court of Appeals, which a lot of judges think are bad. There were Republican judges who spoke out against this idea, but interestingly, the administrative office of the courts didn't say a word about it.
Well, John, so what's wrong with the current system? Under the current system, when a judge reaches the mandatory age of 72 and must retire, then the governor gets to appoint a replacement until the next election cycle comes up. And the person.
I'll tell you what I don't like about that, though this bill doesn't solve it. I don't like the mandatory retirement age at 72.
No, I think that's true.
Long outdated. Some of these judges on the Court of Appeals would like to serve several more years. I think they're entirely, that's the problem. I wish they had addressed that problem head on. But separate from that, there is a debate, and there has been debate for many years, about the North Carolina Supreme Court not taking enough cases.
Yeah.
And the Court of Appeals may be having too many.
This is another example, or appears to be another example, where the legislature is trying to get involved with the appointed powers of the governor. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I wouldn't jump on that one, but I think John's absolutely right. And if I remember correctly, there is a bill in that moves it from 72 to 75. And if you pass that bill, you solve that problem in the short run to begin with.
Yeah. And we've long said on this show that maybe 72 20 years ago isn't what 72 is today, as I can testify.
The thing that frustrates me about this issue, there's so many more pressing problems with our court system, in particular when it comes to funding information technology programs in the clerk of court's office, the lack of assistant DAs and case witness assistants in the district attorney's offices, and then actual having clerks for our superior court judges. There's so many more important issues our judiciary needs to focus on.
And so this is going to end up in another one of those situations where Cooper's going to veto, they're going to override the veto, and here comes another court case.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Well, I'm not sure a court case in this matter would be obviously successful. I mean, it
doesn't make any difference whether it's going to be successful.
Well, I mean, my point is the legislature can
court.
add, the legislature can subtract the Court of Appeals judges, as far as I know. I don't think anybody would argue they couldn't do that.
But it went from, didn't it go from 12 to 15 and now it's going back to 12?
Back to 12.
Okay.
And the legislature does have the authority to do that.
And when it was expanded from 12 to 15, while there was a good argument on workload, it was also a Democrat scheme, flat out, to put 3 more judges on the court. Governor Hunt was going to make the appointment right before he left office, and they weren't going to let those be elected for 4 years.
Right.
So we have a long history of these kinds of activities.
So if we did something that was improper then, let's by God do something improper now. That's the
argument I'm making.
Or let's make it even worse.
Right, make it even worse.
Hog waste. That's the topic after the break. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, "Come on, we're leaving."
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
The House has passed and sent to the Senate a bill that limits damages from nuisance lawsuits against pork producers. Now, this bill would limit the compensation to the actual amount of damage to the person or property involved. It would also not apply to current federal legal lawsuits, including Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the nation. John, hog waste has been a topic that's been long discussed in our state, especially in the areas of eastern Carolina subject to flooding. We know the pork producers are important to the economy of our state, but so too is the environment. Where do you come down on this bill?
Well, on its face, it kind of makes sense to me that if you're talking about a lawsuit to damages to someone's property, the damages ought to not exceed the value of the property. There's some logic to that. However, some of this was an attempt to intervene in litigation that is already underway. And in particular, I'm puzzled. I asked a couple of people about this, and they couldn't explain to me why there was any discussion about a state law that would limit damages in federal lawsuits. I never followed that in the first place. What are they talking about?
Yeah. The question I had, Chris, in all of this is, what's the story behind the story here? I mean, you look at this, and on the face of it, it looks like it makes some common sense, but there's got to be something more here.
Well, the story is that the Smithfield Foods and other hog industries are trying not to be liable for spraying literally hog waste right adjacent to somebody's property and dramatically changing the value of the property, even if the original bill affected lawsuits that were already filed. And Bob Orr, a panelist on NC Spin, Paul Stam, both said that bill was unconstitutional in the form that it originally passed the House. So this is not, it's basically turned out to be property rights versus hog farm rights. Private property rights versus hog farm rights. And it was the first time it was voted, talking about process, the speaker called for a vote, didn't even announce the bill. Nobody knew they were voting on second reading. I'm not making that up. And even a couple of members of his own caucus who actually thought the bill was a good idea, who voted against it because of the way it was handled on the House floor, which raises all kind of questions.
Joe, I guess the question is, if you're an adjacent property owner, how do you prove damage to your property other than, say, smell?
Well, I think one of the things that you could do is you could have agreements before the fact that said, I'm a neighbor and I'm going to share in your profitability because I'm also going to share in the smell and the waste. The other side of that is that this is the unintended consequences of scale. 100 years ago, almost everybody in the country had a hog, and we even had fences that were called horse high and hog tight. And we don't have that anymore. And so this is an issue that comes with scale, and we're trying to grapple with it. We haven't solved it yet.
Yeah, Brad, on the face of it, I don't think anybody's particularly well pleased by this bill from what I've been able to read. Smithfield Foods isn't, the hog producers aren't, the environmentalists aren't,
and the next door neighbors.
Absolutely, and that's the real dilemma. And John's absolutely right. What was the legislature's involvement in acting legislation on an issue that's being heard in federal court? And that's a real big question mark.
And it made a little bit more sense until they stripped the part about the current federal lawsuits out of there in Smithfield Foods. I mean, you can understand that they might have been trying to advocate for pork producers, but when they stripped that out, the existing lawsuits, then I'm like John.
Well, there is such a thing as people abusing the opportunity to go to court for the purposes of, for example, destroying this industry. There are people who think this industry is not worth having, that it causes more trouble than it's worth, and they would like to drive it out of business. So the pork producers have a point that there should be reason.
Right.
The ability to assess damages has to be related to the property that's being damaged. I understand that argument, but starting in midstream and all these other parts of it, that was where the problem lay.
The big question I had as the issue came up, you remember multiple years ago, probably 2000, when Brubaker was Speaker of the House, 94, 95, they dedicated all this money to NC State and Central and A&T to come up with research. Yeah. And where has that money been spent, and why don't we have a product
they
back?
sprayed that money over the field.
They must have.
It got sprayed somewhere. All right, let's change subjects. There's another bill that we want to talk about. In an effort to stop the calendar creep by many school systems, prompted by the tourist industry, North Carolina set mandatory dates that the school year could begin no later than August 26th and must end no later than the second week in June. Well, for more than a decade, school systems have been begging for more flexibility in adapting their calendars. Two bills have passed the House that would allow them to set dates for the beginning and the end of the school calendar. One of the proposals allows the classes to begin August 15th, so high school students can enroll in community college classes. Opponents say this is just a backdoor way of moving the school year earlier into August. Joe, you're the father of a school principal. What do you think of this school calendar flexibility proposal?
Well, I think it's half right. In a perfect world, what we would have is the General Assembly set the number of school days, academic days that are going to be in a year, and the LEAs set the times for the school calendar. And I think that would be the best solution to this agonizing problem.
Brad, the tourism industry has successfully blocked previous attempts. I mean, this bill's come up just about every year. Do they have the clout to do it now?
Yeah, no, I think so. And Connie Wilson, as you remember, passed the bill several years ago, probably 10 years ago now. It is an economic issue for your travel and tourism in the mountains and along the coast. They have a voice in this, and they need to be heard.
Is this going to prevent the calendar creep that we've seen through the years? Because it kept getting earlier and earlier to start school and later and later to end.
It got earlier because people wanted, for example, to end the semester before Christmas.
Yeah.
Instead of coming back after a lengthy holiday and then ending the semester. I mean, there's some logic to that.
So is it going to pass, Chris?
Well, I don't think the Senate is too wild about this idea. Unfortunately, I think that local school systems should have the flexibility. The point is educating our kids in the tourism industry. They'll still take vacations, just it may be at a different time. I think this is an example of, we say education's our priority, but we sure don't act like it.
Yeah. Plus, the LEAs are all, they have a board that's elected by the local folks. And you're right. If you're on the coast and you want different days, fine. If you're on the mountains, fine. If you're in the Piedmont, you're on the MSA, fine. But let those boards make the decision.
Okay, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Many of the 300,000 uninsured in our state are volunteer firefighters, farmers, fishermen, and small business owners. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now comes time for what many of you say is your favorite part of the show, when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Joe Mavretic, we'll start with you.
In the debate about D's and R's for judges, we left out about 30% of the registered voters, and those are the independents. I would like to see the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court register as an independent, send a memo to all the judges in the state and say it's to your advantage, to everybody's advantage, for us to be independent of both D's and R's. Let's send a clear signal. Everybody that's sitting in a bench, be an independent voter.
Boy, that would be interesting. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
I think one of the most compelling arguments for going slow on another round of big tax cuts is Washington. We talk about it all the time on this show. Just one example, President Trump's budget cuts EPA 31%. We get half our funding for our Department of Environmental Quality from the federal government and EPA. So we're going to, it's $50 to $70 to $85 million that we're going to get cut from federal government in just one department, which is far from the biggest department in state government. We have no idea what the cuts are going to be, and yet we're going to take another $1 billion out of our revenue stream with all those questions unanswered.
Interesting. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
So in the most recent High Point University poll, 35% of registered North Carolina voters said they approved of the job that Donald Trump is doing as president. But 61% of registered voters said they think Democrats in Congress should work with Trump rather than trying to fight him, trying to challenge him on everything. In other words, a quarter of North Carolina's voters don't approve of Trump, but thinks the Democrats in Congress should focus on working with him rather than challenging him. That should tell you something about the complex nature of public opinion right now. We have polarization, but also a great hunger to see some grown-ups acting in a grown-up fashion.
Brad Crone, tell us something we don't know.
Well, Tom, I keep hearing there may be some ethics complaints filed against the 4 authors of the legislation, basically saying that the North Carolina should deny and not recognize the equality marriage issue that the Supreme Court issued 2 years ago. That is a violation of their oath of office because they swore on the Bible to uphold the Constitution, the state Constitution, and the rule of law.
And Speaker Moore said this week it's dead. It's not going to see the light of day. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.